Thanks for logging in today. My name is Dan Sturgis. I'm here with my friend and my colleague and my liege, Dr. Lee. Hello, Dr. Lee.
Hi. Hello.
There he is. Dr. Lee saying hello. And here we are at the Merchant's House. We are in the front parlor. It is September 28th, and we want to thank you guys for tuning in to the 5th episode of Live at the Merchant's House. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the history of science at the fringes. And more specifically, we'll be talking about things that were discovered to be impossible to see with your eyes, but with technology and through the advancement of sciences, we are now able to see these things. So, but first, I want to tell you guys, before we get started, I want to tell you guys that in just a couple of days, it turns into October. And which is a big month for the Merchant's House here. And what they do is they have these ghost tours, and we weren't able to do them last year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're doing 3 days this year, and the dates are the 28th, 29th, and 30th. Now, the regular ghost tours, they start at 6:30 p.m. They go to 10 p.m. Each tour is about 55 minutes. It takes you all through the house, and you'll hear all great stories. You'll hear some EVP, some evidence we've collected over the years. I've been investigating the Merchant's House for, I think, 14 years it is now. And Lee's been in since, since right towards the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020. And actually, the pandemic really did give us a great opportunity to do some pretty incredible investigation here. We'll talk about that in just a few moments. But yeah, so October 28th, 29th, and 30th. The regular ghost tours start at 6:30. They go to 10 p.m. And then on those dates at 10:30, they're doing special ghost tours, and they're special because I get to walk around with you guys, and I can answer any kind of questions, and maybe I'll bring in some EVP that isn't played on the ghost tours. We'll play those, and we'll talk about what's going on and the investigations Lee and I have been doing since the beginning of 2020. And because of this pandemic, this worldwide pandemic, Lee and I, and mostly Lee's been doing all the hard work here, have been able to set up the cameras here for all of 2020, and have been able to capture and experiment with different types of equipment that Lee has been designing specifically for the Merchant's House. You want to just talk real quick about that, Lee?
Yeah, so we used a combination of custom sensors and off-the-shelf equipment, and set them up in ways that allowed us to collect data, come up with hypotheses, and then design experiments to test those hypotheses. And we got some pretty interesting data that we think is a first of its kind, and we're just continuing that research, and we'll be able to give you an update on that. At the end of October.
Okay, great. So let's first off, I want to tell everybody that's logged in. I want to say hi to Andrea real quick, and she's a great friend. She runs a ghost tours here in the city called Burrows of the Dead. If you guys haven't been on one of Andrea's tours, you must do it, and this is a great month to do it. She's a fantastic speaker. She gives a great tour. She knows more about New York than any New Yorker I know. So hey, Angela, Andrea, we love you, and I'm gonna come catch one of your tours soon too. I've been on one. They're fantastic. So Lee, when we're talking about the fringes of science, when we're talking about things that weren't able to be seen and almost just theorized, right? Way back in the Roman times and in Greek times, I'm guessing as well. They theorized that I mean, what was it? You sent me notes, but I was reading them on the stoop.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of different examples. So it's partially things that weren't observable, and they required technology to observe. And so, like you said, people just had to guess at the existence of these things up until that point. But throughout science, there's a lot of examples. Throughout the history of science, there's a lot of examples of scientists that have come up with, you can call them unpopular hypotheses about why certain things may happen, and for various reasons they were rejected, ridiculed, whatever, and then sort of proven to be correct. So that, there's a mixture of a lot of stories with those aspects.
Wait, what are they called? I'm sorry, I was reading some notes, and we have a chat room also. So if anybody's got any questions for Lee or I, just type it in the chat room and I'll get to them. I promise I'll get to them. But did you talk about this while I wasn't paying attention? They call them flying monsters or invisible monsters?
Yeah, so it was back in like 36 BC is actually the first date when there's a recorded history of the Romans hypothesizing about the existence of invisible creatures that are too small for us to see. But that remained just kind of like a guess, all the way up until 1675, which is when, and that's almost 2,000 years, which is when the microscope was, or a version of a microscope was invented.
Right.
And that's when this guy Antony van Leeuwenhoek, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but yeah,
Take your word for it.
he described seeing cavorting little wee beasties. And so he was looking at a drop of rainwater and he saw them under his crude microscope, just a lot of little swimmies, single-celled organisms swimming around. And they weren't necessarily bacteria, but they were zooplankton. So those are just little single-celled animals and they have like little hairs on them. They swim around, they eat each other, whatever. So that was sort of the first indication that the invisible microscopic animals existed.
And it's amazing. We've been dealing with this since we've been children. I mean, our moms would always yell at us to wash our hands.
Yeah.
And why? Because there's nothing on our hand. My hand is clean.
Exactly. And I remember even asking as a kid, I was like, I'm using a fork. Like, what are the germs like rolling down the fork with my food? And there was sort of a pause, and my parents were like, yes. But it's interesting that you bring that up because that's sort of the second part to this saga that was not even resolved then. So even after this guy saw these wee beasties swimming around in a drop of rainwater, people didn't make the connection that they might not be the best thing in the world, for our health. So actually, all the way into the 1840s, there were that was sort of the start of like the doctor profession. And doctors would be dissecting corpses to investigate anatomy, and then they would leave right from their corpse analysis and deliver a baby. And there was one particular hospital where there was mortality during childbirth was super high compared to surrounding hospitals. And somebody was given the task of like find out why this is happening, like what's the deal, like. And so he realized that that was exactly the situation that was happening. It was unusual about this particular hospital. Like people would be analyzing a corpse and then go and deliver a baby and then go back to analyzing corpses. And he found that a neighboring hospital that had much lower mortality rate during pregnancy, or during childbirth, they didn't do that. They didn't have that habit. And so he said, maybe this isn't the best idea. Maybe there's like wee beasties essentially that are getting on your hands from these corpses and getting onto the mothers. And he was, hated. All the surgeons hated the fact that he was implying that they were dirty, right? It was actually a sense of pride at the time. If you were covered in blood and gore and stuff, that was kind of like, hey, look, I'm a doctor. Like I deal with internal things, and that makes me cool. So he was rejected for a while. It wasn't until, and he actually ended up retreating from science.
Cheer this way. I'm getting a note the other way.
Oh, okay,
so you're facing the microphone. I'm getting a note that it's difficult to hear you.
Oh, okay.
Come a little bit closer. You're not going to be seen. You have to keep Lee in the shadows here because of the nature of his job. He's got to keep a certain level of
incognito.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Which is a shame because he's a handsome man and you guys are missing out. But let me know if that's a little bit better for him. To hear.
I'm facing the microphone a little bit better now, so hopefully that's a little better.
Thanks, Maria, for the heads up.
Yeah, thank you. This feedback's useful. I mean, he that hypothesis was rejected, and he actually ended up retreating from science, and he just kind of went to his own private life, and he didn't want to deal with it anymore, and so he just kind of wanted peace and quiet. And it wasn't until years and years later that was validated. Like, yeah, there are these germs that you're picking up from corpses that should not be touched around sensitive areas.
Decaying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I don't mean to throw you a curveball here, but microscopes, were they invented because of that? Do you know, or was it for a different reason?
That's a good question. I
And
don't actually know the answer to that.
yeah.
That's a really good question. Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, it might have been invented for totally different reasons, like to
Right.
analyze minerals or something and rocks that were mined. I actually don't know.
Right.
I haven't looked into the history of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's amazing. It's amazing because, you know, the stuff that we're dealing with today, even with like, you know, COVID-19, we can't see it, but we know it's out there. But for so long, you know, things that we take for granted now, like having to wash your hands because your hands,
Yeah.
you know, for
Yeah.
germs, weren't taken for granted back then. It was known. If you couldn't see it, it didn't exist.
Yeah.
And you know, with the invention of the microscope and then the invention of the telescope, where people couldn't see, when you know you're just sitting in a field and looking
Yeah.
up at the sky, you know, there are a lot of times when you can't see the Andromeda galaxy.
Yeah. Well,
And-
I think part of the problem is, I mean, even today, right? You were mentioning COVID, like part of the problem is, yeah, microscopes exist, but you're kind of taking the word of somebody else, and like most people don't have their own microscopes.
Right.
They haven't looked at the drop of rainwater themselves. And so that's part of, I think, why a lot of the reason why there is this doubt, like flat earthers and stuff, they don't have a telescope. You know, there was
Right.
that one flat earther that built a rocket ship so it could go up high enough, and he ended up exploding and dying. But he had the right idea. He wanted to get up high. He wanted
Yeah.
to see for himself. He didn't have this equipment, right?
Right.
So there's actually a lot of projects now that actually intend to not necessarily solve that problem, but it could help solve that problem. They're actually designing scientific equipment for third world countries to make it just more accessible. So it's actually like a paper microscope that somebody
Mhm.
invented. It's basically a pop-up card, kind of like a pop-up book, and
Right.
there's some lenses that come on it, and it lets you see with a microscope. And
Wow.
you know, in fact, that kind of thing would be helpful in the U.S. too. You know,
Yeah.
kind of let people really get engaged in science, and
Sure.
and that's part of what this program is about too. Just kind of like making it more accessible,
Right.
so people can better understand it and better believe in it and better do it themselves and have the right questions.
Right. There's a great documentary about amateur astronomy and telescopes called it's called Seeing in the Dark, and it's only an hour long. It's fantastic, and I'm sure you can find it streaming online somewhere. And it's done almost as a mini movie.
Cool.
But they talk a lot about how, you know, citizens, normal people, can go buy consumer grade
Yep.
telescopes at B&H here in New York,
Yeah.
or telescope.com, where I bought mine, and are able to see things that, you know, Galileo would have dreamed,
Yeah. And they
couldn't
can-
have dreamed
Some
about.
of them discover new planets.
Yeah, and it's
you
one
know.
of the, and I think it's one of the few areas of science where somebody working a 9 to 5 can go out in his backyard after work and contribute to science.
Yeah.
He can discover a meteor, another planet. They have these, geez, I forget what they're called, but people, it's a whole club where they look for dips in stars. You know,
Yeah,
to
exactly. So exactly, they're looking for what are called exoplanets, which
Right.
are basically an Earth-like planet circulating another star.
Right,
Exactly. So they
right.
look at the stars.
They look at the star and see the
look
light
for
dips a
dimming.
little bit.
Exactly.
If it, yeah, and
And that indicates that a planet has passed in front of it and blocked some of the light, and then they can hypothesize that there's a planet there.
right. And I think parapsychology is also another area of science where
Yeah.
people, you know, exactly what we're doing here at the Merchant's House. And I know I send a lot of the stuff that I get down to the Rhine Research Center, and I send it out across the country and around the world to some people, just to say, hey, listen to this EVP, what do you think?
Yeah.
Or look at this picture. In fact, I had a picture taken here at the Merchant's House right above us. That for years I was like, all right, I got a spirit picture at the Merchant's House. And it was like 7 years later, I sent it to a friend of mine, Dave Manganelli, who specializes in spirit photographs. He came across it somehow and said, hey, Dan, you know what I think this is? I think this is, and I went, oh my God, you're right. You know, for so long, I assumed I had gotten lucky, and it was a light on a digital recorder that was, you know, moving around a room.
That's part of the problem. We talked about that in previous episodes. Like, one thing, it's great. It kind of opens up science to everybody, but it's kind of, you know, the problem of like a little knowledge and a lot of power is like a dangerous thing, right? So with astronomy, it's at least has that bar of like you have to invest a certain amount of money, and then there's like these established sort of straightforward-ish techniques that have been validated by science to like find these other planets, right? Like you said, like looking at a star, you see it dim on a certain schedule, and that indicates, oh, there must be a planet orbiting it. So that's something that is kind of like, a recipe for like, oh, I want to find a star, another planet. This is the way I can do it, right? With parapsychology, it's so open, right? There's so many different techniques, and it's so accessible. Like you can just buy things for like $5 on Amazon and go around and record beeps and boops and stuff.
Right.
It makes it hard to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff,
Right.
I'm
I'm gonna write that down too, because that's the next show, peeps and boops and stuff.
yeah, but it makes it super exciting, and if that's, that's part of why we're doing the show again, because it's an extremely exciting field, and this show is about helping people learn how to do it better, right? And sort of be better scientists and use the equipment better, and kind of get hard data that they can actually use to convince other people, which
Yeah. And isn't that sort of the bottom line of what we're dealing with here at the Merchant's House is, as far as spirits, these are, we can't see them with our naked eye.
Yeah.
And so we need instruments, not necessarily to see them, but with what you're doing, we're almost getting there.
Yep.
Exactly. But up until some of the equipment that you're making, and this show is turning into a different show, but that's fine. We've been picking up the wake of the boat.
Exactly.
We haven't seen the boat.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult to look at a wave coming on shore and decide that was a sailboat, that was a powerboat, that was a tugboat. But the stuff that Lee is building at his house is almost giving us the opportunity. We picked up something maybe a month or two ago, maybe the beginning of the summer, where it was almost a figure.
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. So, and that's a good analogy with like the wake of the boat, but also it's, we can even be detecting different frequencies, essentially we're detecting, different frequencies of light that we can't see. And, even Wi-Fi, like the Wi-Fi that is connecting your computer to the internet, that's actually a frequency of, electromagnetic radiation.
Right.
It's all light essentially. It's just a different wavelength that we can't see.
Right.
So all of our sensors are picking up different wavelengths of that. And so some of it may be sort of in effect, like you said, like the wake of the boat, or some of it might actually be these anomalous entities. Yeah. And if we set up the sensors right, we can kind of get these pictures with a sensor that usually just gives a beep or a boop, right? You put enough of those beep and boop and things together,
Right.
and you start creating this image of like a localized entity that is anomalous. Yeah.
Right. A localized frequency. And
Yeah.
it's talking about like the wake of the boat when we have a great audio clip of a natural EMF meter going off on command and responding to us, and whether or not that was a spirit or if it was some kind of intentional PK or psychokinesis coming from my friend Garrett and I, who were here in the parlor behind us. It's all about frequencies, and it's interesting. When I was looking stuff up for tonight, they had a guy had something on YouTube where he's pouring a glass of Coke. He's pouring Coke out of a can, and he put the infrared light on, and Coke was see-through. You couldn't see through it. So it's just a matter, the Coke was there. It's just for whatever reason, it doesn't let that infrared, or lets the infrared light pass through it rather than reflect back. So you can't see it.
Yeah. So part of it is, there are various reasons why you might not see something. One of them is our perception or the sensor we're using. And the other one is even just the commonality of a certain anomaly, right? So like a good example of that in terms of, again, back along the lines of like a certain field of science that was discredited and is now coming into more valid proof for it, ball lightning, right?
Okay.
That's sort of this interesting phenomena that has been, ball lightning is now I can say, because it's been somewhat validated by science, it's a phenomena that has existed throughout history, right? Because it's just an electrical phenomena that happens during lightning storms. It seems to correlate with that.
Or
So-
earthquakes too, right?
Maybe earthquakes do that, I don't know about, but possibly.
Okay.
But if that's true, then our ancestors all the way back to cavemen and before have seen ball lightning, right? And yet, like, we didn't have scientific evidence of its existence until like 2014. That was actually the first time that it was scientifically documented and analyzed. And yet it's been, stories of its existence have existed throughout the years. Fascinating stuff, but stuff that's so crazy that it seems so bizarre and without explanation that scientists put into the same realm as like UFOs and ghosts.
Right.
Like one example, people were having a mass in a church, and a thunderstorm was happening. The orb of light, a ball of lightning, came through the window, destroyed a wall of the church, killed one guy and then like flew out another window, right?
Wow.
And like when you, especially in a church, right, when that happens, like, oh my God, you know,
Yeah,
God
it's
is
some
coming
kind
down,
of
some weird stuff's happening.
divinity.
Exactly. And so, okay, like scientists are like, okay, that's some weird stuff. They're probably making it up. They probably thought this, like, oh, whatever. But then there's other stories from sailors too. Like there's one story, let me see, that in 1749, the HMS Montauk, they saw this huge ball of light after a thunderstorm come flying at them from miles and miles away, like extremely quickly. Flew right up to their ship, flew up the mast, exploded the mast, and then, you know, and I think one guy even got blown off the mast. One guy lost his hands because he tried to touch it as it flying by. This stuff is crazy. Like
Right.
that's so weird. That sounds science fiction. And so all the way up until yeah, it was just like 2014 when scientists were actually trying to record another phenomenon related to lightning storms. And then they saw this ball of lightning occur and they turned their equipment, which happened to be spectral analysis equipment, and started focusing on that. And they're actually able to get a spectrogram of the different frequencies of light that were emitted by it.
Wow.
So that was really the first time when it's like, oh, wow, okay, these things are real.
Right.
And yet they've happened again since the beginning of time.
Sure.
It's just an electrical phenomenon that happens with lightning storms.
Sure,
right?
sure. You know, I saw some stuff on ball lightning where it was, they were calling them ghost lights.
Yeah.
And people down in North Carolina, while they're not always on a schedule,
Yeah.
more often than not, you know, you don't get skunked when
Yeah.
you go out there looking for them. You'll see them, and there's always the legend that it's the lost hikers, and you know, but it could be just some kind of either swamp gas,
Yeah.
or they do attribute a lot of the ball lightning to plates shifting under the ground, and that's causing
Yeah.
so much energy that it's released as
Yeah.
this little ball of energy that bounces around, and people are able to see it.
Yeah, so people were trying to replicate it in a laboratory environment, and they were able to replicate certain aspects of it, but never like the full spectrum of you know, personality or characteristics of the ball lightning. But the best hypothesis currently is that lightning actually will vaporize certain minerals that are in the soil, or you know, in like swamps, whatever, and those will actually ignite and start illuminating, you know, emitting light and create this phenomenon. So that's the best hypothesis currently. But up until recently, yeah, it was kind of like individuals might see it, but they never happened to have their phone with them, record it. Like if you look up on even YouTube today, you can't really find anything. You see some fake stuff, and you see something that's like a tiny speck in the sky, but there's no real good documentation of it until this thing in 2014. Yeah.
It's funny, you know, I get clips for the show for Paranormal Caught on Camera on Travel Channel. Check your local listing.
Yeah.
And but you know, we get a lot of clips for ghost lights, and I think some of it might be that, or you know, there's always a rumor that it was a train conductor who's holding a lantern now, looking for his head because he was decapitated. But why would you need a lantern if you don't have eyes to see? It doesn't make any sense. But yeah, you know, these things have been around for a long time.
Yeah. And the weird part is how they seem to behave somewhat intelligently. Like they'll come through windows, they'll fly down a hallway. It was even observed once in a airliner, commercial airliner.
Yeah, I remember hearing about
went down the aisle of the airliner and then went out the back, and people were watching it fly past. And it's like, you know, if it's going down the aisle.
I have a name, Piezo. It had a scientific name.
There's piezoelectric. Might be what you're thinking of. Yeah.
I want to try and crush it. Another cool thing which I'd like to talk to you about is it's called the invisible ship, and there's rumors and there's diary entries, and Captain Thomas Cook, Christopher Columbus, and a lot of the sea captains who were out exploring and finding these new lands, that when they would pull up to these islands, the natives wouldn't be able to see them. They didn't come out to greet them. They didn't come out to see what was going on. A lot of these big, giant, tremendous ships weren't able to pull up to the beach, so they would have to send out a party in a canoe. But when the big ships were on the horizon, nobody would notice them, and it's theorized that it's because these natives had no idea what these shapes were. They didn't, there's nothing, when we see something, when I'm looking at you, or if I look at an object, if I look at this mouse, you know, I'm looking at the reflection of that mouse, and it's going into my brain, and my brain's going through its card catalog of similar objects, and it goes, oh, that's a computer mouse, because I know what that is. And you know, when I guess when the natives would look out, and you know, that reflection would come back into their eyes, and it would go into their brain, and their brain would look for something similar, and there's nothing similar.
Yeah.
So there's nothing to connect it to.
Yeah.
So they couldn't see it.
So there's a foundation of that in neuroscience, which it may or may not be, relevant to what happened, but it's sort of relevant in concept, which is, again, in neuroscience, people have done some pretty weird experiments. One of them was looking at this, basically the way that the visual cortex develops. The visual cortex is the region in the back of the human brain that responds to the eye's information. And so they got cats, and when they were born, they put special glasses on them, essentially, that either let them only see horizontal lines or only see vertical lines. And so the cats that they put these glasses on, that they only let them see horizontal lines, they let them grow up, and after a year or whatever, they take off the glasses. And literally their visual cortex had developed such that it was not responsive to the other angle of line. And so they would bump into table legs or bump into, anything vertical, because they literally could not see it. Their brain would not process that. So those photons were reflecting off of those table legs and hitting their eye and activating their retina and, going to their cortex, but their brain just couldn't process it.
There's no reference.
Exactly. Yeah. So, that may or may not be what was happening in that case,
Right.
but yeah, there is a correlation.
It's funny. I was talking with my friend Rudy, who's smarter than us all, and I explained that to him. He goes, "Yeah, but then wouldn't babies be blind, when they're born?" And I was like, "You got me there, man."
Oh, because they haven't had experience with all that.
Right. But there, I did see a really cool lecture about babies and whether or not they are hardwired to have fear, a flight response, and they had a really cool video of a baby in utero, and the mom was getting a needle, and the needle was going towards the baby, and the baby shielded itself from the needle.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
Huh.
which is kind of cool.
I know that after birth with young babies, the way they test, like whether there's fear or not, at least they do this for rats, and I think they do it for babies too, is they put them on a sort of a table where there's like a cliff, but there's a glass covering over that cliff. So the baby is perfectly safe. They're not going to fall off the cliff, but they see whether they stop at the edge or whether they just keep going. They don't
What do they know? They
yeah,
know what the
exactly.
cliff is.
And there is a certain age where they stop and they're like, oh my God, like I know this is dangerous, and I don't think that's necessarily due to a past experience in which they've walked off a cliff, but it's due to a certain brain development stage at which it's like, oh, like I can now perceive 3D, and like I'm just inherently going to recognize that's a dangerous spot. I'm not going to walk over this glass, over that corner.
I came up with something when I was reading. It was about neuroscience, and they were talking about, there was a bunch of different numbers that the brain receives, I think, 11 million bits of information a second, and but only processes for our consciousness, for our conscious mind, like 50 bits, and they're usually mostly self-serving, basically keeping you standing up or sitting down and not falling over and not bumping into things when you're walking. It's really just to get around.
Yeah.
But if that's the case, that's a lot of bits of information that we're missing. Who knows what's around us all the time that our brain just says, you know what, you don't need to know that right now.
Exactly.
So you can't see it.
Absolutely. So that happens to an extent, not quite to that degree. It's more than like 50 bits, but yeah, absolutely. The brain throws out a ton of information because it's just useless, right? It's like if you're doing a certain task, we're focusing on the task at hand. If we paid attention to everything all at the same time, that wouldn't help us.
Right.
But so it wouldn't help us in a natural state that we evolved in, right? It's like, hey, if you're hunting and like your dog's coming up with a lollipop in its mouth, like you don't want to pay attention to that. I don't know, it's a bad example, but throughout evolution, like it's very important to be able to focus on certain tasks and do them very well, right?
Yeah.
But if you artificially take somebody and put them in a special environment in which that's not necessarily the case, in which maybe it's actually beneficial for them to pay attention to a lot of things, then that kind of cognition, that kind of brain is actually advantageous, right? So that's the thought behind why there's some actually individuals, maybe autistic or with different brain types, that they process information differently, and that way of processing is disadvantageous from a traditional historical evolution point of view,
right? But
it can be advantageous for certain tasks, right? Let's say you're in a certain environment where that is helpful,
right?
So that may be part of why those quote unquote different types of brains, different types of processing still exist.
Right.
And the more we evolve our surroundings, right, like the more we control our surroundings, we build houses and we regulate the temperature and we have food ready and all that, it kind of changes the type of brain and type of processing that's advantageous for that environment.
Right. I saw a great video, I think it might have been on 60 Minutes, of a gentleman who only had peripheral vision and he could only see here.
Yeah.
And he could stand in front of, he was in London and he was standing in front of an old famous historic building and he drew it.
Yeah.
And but he couldn't see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he couldn't see it. I mean, his brain, obviously something was capturing an image.
Yeah.
Because he was able to transfer it onto the paper, but
Yeah.
he wasn't seeing it the way we could see it. He would turn sideways and go, I could see it there, but when I'm looking straight on, and he was drawing it when he was looking straight on. It was amazing.
Yeah, there's some fascinating experiments. They're called split brain experiments. So there's some people that have had the connection between the two halves of their brain cut for medical reasons to stop seizures or whatever. And in everyday life, you wouldn't notice that that individual has had that procedure performed on them. But if you conduct certain specific experiments on them, you can see this really weird behavior where you have them close one eye, or you somehow you can basically present images in a way that it's only presented to one eye, not the other. So you can do that, and you can see evidence that the two sides of the brain are not communicating with each other. So, for instance, they'll be able to draw what you're showing them. If you're showing it to their left eye, they'll be able to draw it with their right hand, but not with their left hand. That's
Right.
not just because of the right hand; you can do it vice versa too.
Right.
Because literally, like their left eye is communicating with half the brain that's controlling that arm,
Right.
but not vice versa. So like their two arms are getting information about two different things. You know? So yeah, it's fascinating how the process works.
Yeah, it's when my dad unfortunately had a stroke, and it affected his right side, his right hand, and so when he was doing physical therapy and occupational therapy, one of the therapists, he could move his left hand pretty good. My dad was a righty, so he was awkward with his left hand.
Yeah.
And but she would strap his left hand down to his body and have him do these exercises.
Yeah.
First, he would do it with his left hand, free, not strapped down, and he would have difficulty putting screws on nails, is what it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as soon as she strapped down the left hand, the right hand got better because your brain said, okay, I could use my left hand if I wanted to, but now I can't. So I have to get it done with my right. And I read a book called My Stroke of Insight. If you ever want to read a great book about the brains. There was a woman, she was she mapped the brain. She was the head of the neuro department, I guess, at Harvard University, I believe. She was young, 39, had a stroke, and she could, after her recovery, she was beginning her recovery, she could send an email. She could type in English, but you couldn't read it.
Yeah.
But you could type it.
That's interesting.
In perfect thing.
Sometimes that works with singing too. People aren't able to speak, but they're able to sing what they want to say.
Right.
So there's actually slightly different circuits in the
Or
brain.
people that have a stutter who if they're reading lines, actors or singers who have a stutter and but they don't have a stutter when they're acting or singing.
Yeah.
Maria is asking if we're going to show a video taken inside the museum during the shutdown. We're not tonight, but we will in the future for future shows, maybe in the next show that.
And also during the October tours at the end of the tours.
Oh, right, Maria. If you come to check out one of these tours on the 28th, 29th, 30th, and then also on the 31st there'll be a concert. Anthony Bella, one of the board members, he'll be here singing in the parlor. So him and his group. Chant Macabre, I believe it's called. So it's really great to come see these guys and support the museum. But if you come to one of the tours, one of the things that you'll be seeing on the tour are the videos of these images that we've captured here with Lee's sort of groundbreaking, never before used anywhere else equipment. And so you can come check that stuff out. And I think some of it's going to be interactive, so you can see how that would work. When we're talking about ghosts and spirits, we're talking about the consciousness that has survived bodily death. So we're hoping that what these sensors are picking up is that, and the consciousness will will give us what it wants us to see. So its most familiar form will be the form of the person.
Yeah, so I mean, we've seen indications of that, like Dan said, the sensors activate in sort of a way that seems to indicate some kind of vague silhouette. But and we've also seen it seems like it's acting as in a different form, as sort of a more localized sort of, I guess you can call it ball or spear form, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, that's sort of from our recordings again. That seems to, our current hypothesis is that it seems like that's the way they these anomalies or entities or ghost spirits may travel around. So in the recordings we made in the hallways, the sensor grids were being activated in a way that seemed to indicate sort of this localized ball of whatever anomaly passing through them and passing past them.
You know, of course, we haven't had, I haven't had at least any luck here at the Merchant's House or any of my other investigations where we've been able to have a spirit or the consciousness describe what they are through EVP. Most of the EVP we catch is either just a single word, or at the most a short sentence, but we haven't been able to have a long conversation. But through mediums, we're able to do that. And you know, I was not a medium guy and a psychic guy. There are more psychos than psychics out there, and I met two people. One was an 8-year-old girl, and on an investigation, who was a really talented medium. And then my friend, my dear friend,
8-year-old girl.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, she was amazing.
Oh, cool.
She was amazing. And Richard Scholler, who's an adult and adult plus, he's like 6'9", and sweetest guy I know. And these two people changed my mind. And and it's great when we talk about frequencies and able to see things that aren't with your naked eye. Richard, I can be in the room with him. We were here at the Merchant's House, and he was speaking to Mr. Treadwell.
Yeah.
And
seeing
him, he described him exactly the way he should be described. Now, Richard had no idea where he was going. He had never heard of Seabury Treadwell before we got here, but I wasn't seeing it. I wasn't seeing Mr. Treadwell. I wasn't hearing Mr. Treadwell. And same thing up in Gertrude's room. He was communicating with Gertrude, and but I couldn't see him. And so through mediums, that's how we get our information about how these spirits exist and coexist. And there's a great medium who worked with my mentor and close friend, Lloyd Auerbach, who described herself as just energy. And she didn't know how it worked. She goes, and that's the best way I can describe it, is I'm energy, and I can appear to you or someone who's able to see me in any form I want. So I can be either, my younger self, or my middle-aged woman self, or my grandma's self. And mostly she appeared to a little boy who was a medium and didn't know it. And as a grandmotherly figure, and did that for years. And then when that little boy got married and had kids, his kids could see her.
Yeah. So that's the thing that part is fascinating, right? Yeah. It's like, so, assuming that some of these, mediums are indeed seeing an entity that is indeed there, and it's not just a hallucination or whatever, that part's fascinating. It's like, what is the mechanism behind that?
Right.
And so that's part of what makes a lot of these histories of science on the fringes stories happen, why things are initially rejected, and partially it's due to this lack of existing mechanism.
Right.
So even like the guy that was saying like, hey, you should wash your hands after playing with a cadaver, a lot of surgeons just didn't believe in the mechanism. They're like, what, why, what am I washing off, right? It's like they still didn't quite believe that there were these bacteria that could cause illness. They didn't think that was a transmission vector for illness, even though they'd observed these wee beasties with a microscope. So that's really a consistent part of the pattern of like this initial rejection of these novel thoughts within science. It's that lack of mechanism. And so that is going to be a core to really making this research convincing too, right? You can record anomalies all you want, and you might have somebody that has a super convincing medium that describe somebody the way they were without knowing anything about it. But until you can find some kind of mechanism, and by mechanism I mean, like, let's say we find some sort of protein in the eye that these people have that other people don't, that
Right.
can receive certain wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation that other people can't. That's an example, right? And that's kind of, who knows, like maybe we'll be able to find some. There are actually some indications of certain proteins that may be promising in that respect. There are actually certain proteins that can be affected by, by quantum effects. In fact, there's some proteins like that in pigeons that allow them to better see magnetic fields as they fly around. Those same proteins are also susceptible to some quantum effects. So, and again, that right now this is a lot of hand waving because nothing's been proven, but there are at least theoretically possible mechanisms that could be out there that would allow these certain people or certain animals, whatever, to see things that others can't.
Right.
And that's going to be sort of a key to really getting widespread acceptance of this research, if indeed those things even exist. If that
Right. And I've come across it often. And unfortunately, I've been a jerk to people a lot. Where they'll say, my dog stares at the corner of the room,
Yeah.
and or my baby, my infant, is
Yeah.
staring at a spot on the wall, or my cat is hissing,
Yeah.
at the ceiling in the corner.
Yeah,
It's odd, and our babies, I think, their brains are running at a different frequency while they're infants, and that's what people would say to me. I think my infant child is seeing a ghost, and I'm like, well, your infant child could also be seeing a crack in the paint for the very first time.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating.
And they stare at their hands too.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And there's a lot of possible explanations like that.
Right.
So that makes it hard too to really convince other people that it's worth looking into, because it's so easy to just wave your hand and be like, no, they're just like freaking out.
I know. I always say, well, put your dog on the phone and let me see what he was saying.
Yeah.
It doesn't do me any good if I can't talk to the dog. We were talking right before we started the show about, hospice and what people experience and what people see, in the process of passing away. I was telling you about my dad and who passed away in home hospice and was lucid right up to the very end. But while he was lucid, he would, and my dad was Hemingway, he was a big tough guy, but I'd be talking to him and he'd be talking away to me, and then he would look into the corner of the room and he would stare at the corner of the room. I go, what are you looking at, Dad? He'd be like, nothing. And talk to me, and then slowly his eyes would go over to the corner of the room. So I wonder if the body, in the process of getting ready to transition, is utilizing some proteins that you don't use every day.
Exactly. And that's the right line of thinking. Exactly. It's like, hey, let's think about what basically allows us to do everything, and right now it's proteins. So like, hey, maybe there's a shift to maybe certain proteins die earlier when you have lower blood pressure, which is something that happens as you're passing away, your heart is starting to fail, whatever. There are definitely, obviously, bodily mechanisms that start changing when you're passing away, because that's literally what passing away is. It's like a big change in your body mechanism, and you're no longer a mechanism, right?
Right.
So as those changes are occurring, certain different proteins might be coming into play and be taking over for other proteins that are no longer performing their function.
And maybe these mediums or these people that have these abilities that we don't, maybe those proteins are always.
Exactly.
I think we just solved it right here. We just solved it all.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, we got some 15 more minutes. Hey, if anybody's got any questions, again, just shoot us a message into our little chat section here.
Yeah.
And
we I have one or two other examples too. If
sure.
We can get into if people are curious about just additional examples of scientists that had hypotheses that were sort of discredited and looked down upon and ended up being true. One really interesting one that people might have actually heard of, it's a little better well known, is the guy that got the Nobel Prize for discovering how ulcers formed. He initially he was assigned to find out, hey, try to find out a mechanism behind why ulcers are forming. And the mechanism at that time, when he was first looking into this, it was thought that it was all just due to basically the person's imagination was under too much stress, and that was causing them to create too much stomach acid, and that was like burning a hole in their stomach and creating this ulcer. And so there was a lot of kind of hand waving, and yet that was the accepted thing that doctors would say. They'd just say, "Oh, okay, it's like your mental problem basically, and that's causing the problem." So this guy started realizing like
Which would be mind over matter.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, which exactly. So exactly, they say that, and then at the same time, they're saying a lot of times that's not possible.
Right.
And that's become a lot more accepted in science recently. But at the time, yeah, it was kind of this weird dichotomy. Yeah. Yeah, this guy started realizing that people with ulcers very commonly had a very specific type of bacteria in their stomach, and it was kind of this weird shaped, like S-shaped bacteria. So even though he had this, he was saying that he had a mechanism, again, back to mechanism, people would discount it and say, that's impossible. It's like bacteria can't survive in the acid of the stomach. It's like way too acidic. It would kill everything. And so even though he was getting these slides and literally like seeing it in a microscope, people would be like, no, I just don't believe you, right? I don't want to believe it. So part of it comes down to too, also, it's some people think that there was just this huge industry too of these doctors that would get people with ulcers. And it was kind of the perfect specialty and the perfect patient because you couldn't really do anything to solve it. You could just say like, hey, it's your problem, like, be less stressed, maybe here's some antacids and like, and some sleeping pills. And then the person would come back a month later and complain again, right? And so it was a pretty good business. So people didn't really want a proper answer to it. They don't want to believe this one guy that thought he had some magical bacteria that could survive in the gut and and cause these ulcers. So he had a lot of trouble proving this, right? And so he even tried getting this bacteria, putting it in mice, right, doing it scientifically in a lab, and none of the mice got ulcers from this bacteria. And so what he ended up realizing is this bacteria only exists in humans, right? And so again, like a lot of scientists, they're all like, oh, like, isn't that convenient? Like, that's why it didn't work, right? And so this guy, he couldn't get any funding. Nobody believed him. He couldn't get any funding. He's finally like, screw it. He gets a patient that has an ulcer. Before he gives him antibiotics, which totally cure him within like a day, because this guy, he already knew at this point, it's like, I just give him antibiotics and they're fine. Right. So his patients at least were fine, and nobody else were. So he's like, okay, before I give you antibiotics, I'm gonna take a sample from you. So he took some of this guy's bacteria from his gut. He shook it up in a jar. He friggin' drank it, and then within the next 10 days, he got an ulcer. And he got one of his buddies, one of his colleagues, like, hey, stick a scope in my stomach, and I want you to see this friggin' ulcer that's in my stomach. And they documented it. And so finally, they were able to get enough, belief, like, oh, this guy believes in so much. He infected himself. He got an ulcer within 10 days. Okay, maybe there's something there. And other people started doing similar studies, and he ended up winning the Nobel Prize for this discovery, right? So there's a lot of, science is, should be science of like, open-mindedness, and you follow data, whatever, but there's so much, we're all humans, right? There's politics and everything. And, there's reasons for illogical reasons, unscientific reasons that people discount your data, even if you have a mechanism and even if, you have all this evidence. And so the thing is, you can make that argument for a lot of fields, including parapsychology, et cetera, and you can say, oh, that's why people don't believe it. And it might actually be because maybe there's actually nothing there, but there is still that possibility that, hey, part of the reason why this is not getting accepted, even with good data, is that people just don't want to believe it. And they have a good reason for wanting to not believe it.
Sure, and a lot of the the older scientists, the old school scientists, it goes against their entire life's work.
Exactly.
So they don't want to, even if they kind of maybe part of them does believe it, they're certainly not going to come out and say, oh, I believe it, I've been wrong my entire life.
Yep. Exactly.
Hey, I got a question from Jonathan. Is asking, what is your favorite preferred tech to use for detection? And that's a cool question, Jonathan. Thank you. And for years, I was all about tech, and because I didn't believe in psychics and mediums. I like, and it's funny, when you say preferred tech, when you can always tell how long somebody's been investigating the paranormal by how much equipment they bring on an investigation. And when I first started out, I remember going on an investigation multiple times and having to rent vans to bring all the stuff. I had,
Just for your stuff.
yeah, monitors, DVRs, because you see it all on TV and it looks like they know what they're doing. And I had, 3,000 feet of cable, BNC cable, and looked impressive. Never caught anything. And so now when I go on an investigation, usually I have a little case. It's got like 3 MF meters in it and a couple of recorders. And I love bringing a really, really good psychic medium. Somebody
That's the new tech.
Yeah, exactly. And I also love to bring somebody who has never been on an investigation before, because I think that's just a cool energy and it's fun to watch, especially if they experience something. And then hook up with somebody like Dr. Lee here, who's just, looking at this from a completely different angle than I looked at all the time. And so I've learned a lot from Dr. Lee, and he's opened my eyes a lot to a lot of things that I wouldn't really think about before. So
yeah, I mean, along the lines of what you were saying, like I would say it's less, because the field is so open at the moment, and there's so many possibilities how we may or may not be able to detect these anomalies that may or may not exist. It's less about the tech you bring and more about how you use it, right?
Exactly.
Using it properly. Yeah.
Yeah, and just because you're walking around with a piece of scientific equipment doesn't mean you're using it scientifically. In fact, I argue with people all the time, investigators, and they'll say, "Oh, an EMF goes to the EMF," and I said, "Are you using that right? What's it? What's it calibrated at?"
Yeah.
And they don't even know. I said, "Well, how can you use it if you don't know what it's calibrated at? At the very least."
Yeah, and so part of that, for listeners' background is, there's certain frequencies that are more often given off by common electronics and the wires in their walls, etc. And then again, just how you use it. Do you have one? Do you have two right next to each other? Do you have a grid of them? Are you using it when you're there, when you're not there? Do you have walkie-talkies going at the same time?
Yep.
So,
walkie-talkies, your Kia walkie-talkie. If you get a text message, it's going to set your K2 meter off.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then you get a false positive.
Yeah.
Because remember, Jonathan, if you read anything about Harry Price, one of the original ghost hunters or paranormal investigators, he rented the Borley Rectory for a year, I believe, and he had a pencil and a piece of paper and did great investigations there. So and it's whatever you're comfortable using. Don't watch the TV shows looking for tips. They might point you in the right direction, but I think more often than not, they're gonna give you a false positive and teach you the wrong way how to use something. They look cool on TV. I worked on some of these shows, and they like the stuff with lots of lights.
Yeah.
Oh, use that.
Yeah. The more they light up, the better.
They make noises. Yeah. I mean, I would EMF meter, a tri-field natural EMF meter, a voice recorder, and some people that you trust.
Yeah, and if you want to see more details on these centers and how we use them, again, these upcoming tours in October, you'll actually be able to see a demonstration of them and see some videos.
Yep. And if you come on one of the 10:30 shows, I'll bring some stuff, and maybe we'll do mini EVP sessions in each one of the rooms we go visit. And I'll do that. I'll bring everything I bring on an investigation, and
not the full van.
Yeah, not the full van. We won't have that. We'll just have my little case. So Jonathan, I hope you make it. Let's see. Maria's saying, "I refuse to get vaccinated, so I am a leper in my own hometown and can't come to the tours or ever visit the museum again. So I hope your upcoming webinars will include video taken with the museum during the shutdown." Okay, Maria. Yeah, we will do that. What was the phrase used before? Beeps, pops, and stuff?
Beeps and boops. Yeah.
Beeps and boops. When we're gonna do a show called Beeps and Boops and stuff, and we'll play. I think our first show we played a lot of stuff, and one of the upcoming shows, either the next one or the one after, we'll pull out all the stops and we'll play all the video and all the EVP and show some cool pictures, and because I know that's interesting to watch rather than listening to Lee and I drone on and on. But yeah, we'll do that for sure, Maria. We'll do that for sure.
Yeah, and we mentioned this in previous shows too. A lot of the data we're collecting, we're actually we're planning on hopefully publishing it in a scientific journal. And a lot of scientific journals are actually not open access, but we plan on publishing it in open access scientific journal so that anybody can see the data without subscribing to it, without having to pay a subscription or anything like that.
I have a question from Julian. This might be for you, Lee. It said, "Have you heard of the Green Bank area where there is no 5G or Wi-Fi the big scope capturing signs from space?
No, I think I know along the lines of what they're talking about in terms of like a radio telescope.
Right,
But
which is a bunch of,
so there's actually a couple versions. Yeah, there's like the Arecibo telescope
Right,
that
the big
recently got
array,
damaged.
and
Yeah,
yeah,
but
yeah.
then there's also arrays of them. Yeah, too.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and that large array actually, it's like a worldwide array,
Mhm.
and that's actually an array that they were able to use for the first time to capture an image of a black hole.
Mhm.
And yeah, the reason they needed that big of an array was because of the distance of
Would
the black hole.
5G and Wi-Fi affect?
That's an excellent question. I don't know enough about the frequencies
Yeah.
that, black holes and these other
Right.
astronomy features are emitting, but yeah, I don't actually know.
Yeah, and we have just along those same lines, the Merchants House here has Wi-Fi. We've set up a giant, Wi-Fi network here now. And the Merchants House people were having experiences in the Merchants House before Wi-Fi came to the city for sure. And certainly way before cell phones and digital cell phones and analog cell phones. So people were having experiences. So I don't know. It doesn't seem to be, at least here at the Merchants House, that those kind of frequencies or that kind of energy in the house is keeping anybody from having an experience. People are having experiences. We're picking stuff up this year. So, but that's a great question, Julian.
Yeah, and that, like Dan said, it's good to, if you want to conduct science properly, always ask those questions, try to look into details of how experiments were done, how the sensors were used, what the controls of the environment were, et cetera.
Yeah, it's funny. I was doing a lecture over the weekend, and I always tell everybody when I do a lecture, I said, if you think anything I'm saying is BS, just call me out on it. I appreciate that.
Exactly.
I love a debate.
Yeah, and honestly, sometimes, we haven't thought about it. It's a good point, and it's like, oh, we should actually modify the experiment because, if somebody's mentioning it, it's a good point. A scientist is going to notice it in the future too and criticize it, so might as well correct it if it's correctable before that. Like we don't want to believe in something that's fake. We're trying to get real data and like find out what's actually there. And if a tweaked experiment that corrects for some problem like 5G messing with the experiment eliminates it, then it eliminates it. That's the idea. Like let's try to find out what reality really is, not come up with fake data that pretends like it is what we want it to be.
Or correcting data to
Exactly.
fit what we want.
Yeah.
Well, all right. I think here we are. I'm wondering how much you would learn further. That's a great question, and it's a long one. We've got a minute left, Lucian, but it's photography. It's tough, especially now. Digital photography, people can fake stuff, and I catch people faking photographs and videos a lot.
Or unintentionally faking it, like they accidentally
by
capture,
mistake,
like you said,
false positive, or you get infrared shadows. Somebody using an infrared camera and they're behind you, and suddenly you have a shadow man down the hallway, but it's really just a shadow. Photographs, the images. We have a great image taken here at the Merchants House that I didn't take. It was taken way before I started working here with the Merchants House, taken by a doctor from Toronto. But I love looking at photographs. A lot of times photographs are what get you into a place. Photographs will get people interested in is there possibly something. I picked up an image on in my kitchen, and can you guys come in and see if something's happening? The only bad part about that is sometimes you might see an image which is completely explainable, and now every creak you hear in your house is going to be, oh, it's that ghost that I got a picture of in the kitchen. But I wish I could expand more on your and answer more of your questions, but we are running out of time here. I want to again mention that the Merchants House, and you guys would really come take one of these tours. It's going to be the 28th, 29th, and 30th. They start at 6:30 to 10 p.m. and then we're going to do a couple of tours at 10:30 on those nights with me, and we'll walk around, and I'm going to bring my my little case of goodies and show you guys what we use. So please, you got to make a reservation. You got to go to merchantshouse.org. They could really, the Merchants House, the museum could really use your support. And you're not only doing a good thing for the museum, but you're going to have a lot of fun. I promise you that. And again, Lee.
And thanks to everybody for your questions and your curiosity and your interest.
Yeah, and it was great talking to you, great listening to you, and I hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And Lee, always a pleasure, brother.
Yeah,
appreciate it. And beep boops and stuff coming up. All right. So again, thank you everybody for coming and logging in. And if any of the people that came and were on the stoop, apparently they thought there was an event here at the house. And they were going across the street. They were going to watch on their phones. So sorry about that, guys. And, we'll see you next time around. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.